first speaker is Inua Ellams, and as he is going to tell you about his tricks, his tips, his tricks, and his tools for how to tell thrilling stories. So Inua was born in Nigeria. He is a poet, he is a playwright and a performer, along with being a graphic artist and a designer and a founder of the Midnight Run, which is an arts-filled nighttime urban walking experience. Awesome, I know, just awesome. The Rhythm and Poetry Party, the RAP Party, which celebrates poetry and hip hop, and Poetry and Film /Hack, which is PNF/H. And both of these, they celebrate poetry and film. So identity, displacement, and destiny are reoccurring themes in his work, where he tries to mix the old with the new and the traditional African oral storytelling with contemporary poets, and paint with pixel, texture with Victor. His books are published on Flipped Eye, Nine Arches, Penned in the Margins, and Abiran and Methuen. I didn't say that right. But I am personally very, very excited to hear from him. I am a fellow storyteller. As a drama therapist, I use the power of stories immensely in my work. And again, that idea of linking it to the traditional, traditional stories of old is essential. So your blend of Nigerian storytelling with the more contemporary elements, I cannot wait to hear it. So I'm gonna hand it over to you, and given on the huge amount of work that's needed in the world, your thoughts and advice for how would-be activists, current activists, how they can become more poets and storytellers. What is the power of storytelling? And it's part of telling a different story about the future and what that feels like to be human in the world. So I would invite you, please, to share a poem or two, we're not going to be too greedy, about what it means to be human, and to keep it in connection with our humanity in this changing and ever-challenging world. So are there any skills or tips that you'd like to share with people for how to become better at communicating in stories? Now, I've given you a whole mouthful there, quite a few questions, but I want you to have a stab at it. Over to you. Inua.
Thanks, Monica. I don't know if I'm going to do all of that, because there are novelists who've been writing for my whole life, longer than I have, who are still trying to figure out how to tell better stories. I'm just going to talk about maybe just my work and read a few examples from that. I have a book that came out 2 years ago, how time flies, and it's full of expletives. And the book is called The Actual Fuck, and it contains 55 poems. And each poem's title begins with that ubiquitous 4-letter word. And the reason why I wrote the book primarily is, the reason why the conceit for the book emerged was because of some of the class built into the poetry ecosystem, and some of the dynamics of language, which is wedded into how we think of wedded into class and the politics of language as a poet, especially being a poet of color. And when I first started writing, I thought there are far more interesting ways to be aggressive, to be pointed, to be offensive with language, should I wish to be. Therefore, using 4-letter words, using harsh language was somehow beneath me, until I listened to a documentary, which was an interview, I think it was Miles Davis talking about James Brown, or James Brown talking about Miles Davis. And James Brown, to compliment Miles Davis, said, "That motherfucker's a motherfucker." And it struck me that there were so many shades of understanding and nuance built into that I thought there's something that I've been denying myself here. And how can I write poetry that does use harsh language, that reveals something truer, something beneath? And this is how words work in general. A word is a symbol, is an icon of meaning, is metaphoric of so much. There's so much built into it, And I began to carve out these series of poems, which begin with this 4-letter word. But all of them also were built on the pyramided structures of thought and research and my own interest as a human being, and poetry is just the capstone, is the top of the pyramid. One of the first things that I discovered, the more I looked at the meta aspect of storytelling, is that when you're writing, you're lying. Everything is fiction. The only truth, the only absolute truth, is one which includes the voices of everyone alive at the same time, or everyone involved in the same subject matter. And a story, for instance, a story of humanity would take all of time to tell, because it will include all the human beings who've ever been alive and who are alive right now. It would require 8 billion people on Earth to talk about what it means to be human. So when you're writing from your own point of view, it's a very liminal point of view, right? It's 1 over a million. That's how fraction it is. So you have to accept that at best you're presenting a version of the truth, which is so small it's tantamount to a lie. But a single voice is a lying voice. And if you are lying, how inclusive a lie can you tell to reach a broader audience? How broad can you be whilst being specific? This is the challenge of writing poetry. And for me, the answer is to let sincerity, which underpins all of poetry, to be the DNA of your stories. To tell your audiences you are lying to them whilst lying to them, and let the lie be part of the story, in which case the dynamics change. They're included in the room. And if you and everything kind of settles. And if you're dreaming, the dream becomes collective, because we accept that this is the nature of it. And I wanted to read 2 poems that do similar things. The first is called Fuck Nestle, which is written and inspired by Nestle's activities in West Africa. You can search online. There are really horrible things to do with extreme marketing and to teach women of color, particularly in West Africa, that breastfeeding was bad in order to get them hooked on formula milk, etc. And this poem came out of that, but the particular lens was very liminal, very specific, but I think it speaks to larger truth. My twin sister called me when she started producing milk, and that was the spark of this poem. Fuck Nestle. Miriam, laughing that she'd started lactating, become fountain of youth, her body a freestanding factory for one, calls months later, when in the closed cave of her son's mouth, a tooth poked through, glimmering white and wet as starlight, wise men followed to Bethlehem. And what's a mouth if not moist galaxy? What's milk if not primordial waters? What's a mother's chest if not Eden? And what is breastfeeding if not the passing of divine knowledge, the baby latching on, learning the body's soft frontier of flesh, and the tongue's first and firmest purpose is this language. And then oftentimes their gaze will catch, and the knowing between them is old and wise as the quiet hum of hills. Just think, the newly born, deprived of this. Fuck Nestle forever. The second poem that I'll read in this same idea of taking a very liminal way of understanding and looking at the world, but yet letting it be in the basis of so much, is called Fuck White Savior Complex. The title is pretty self-explanatory, but the story shifts. Her name is Jane or Amber. She will have the best of intentions. She will have the petal of this reason for a tongue. She will have been 5. The glow of the National Geographic will have bathed her face golden. She will have paused on the dark child's swollen belly, thin lips, the ribs, the limbs, the flies. She would have slipped off her big sister's Louboutins, skipped the playroom, through her mother's walk-in wardrobe to the pool to ask if the child could attend supper. Her mother's laugh will shimmer her diamonds. She will explain the world is the world. Some work hard, like your father, forging oil contracts. Some just don't, but we're still to help the poor in Africa. She'll have wanted to ever since. Her utmost sincerity will cut you to silence. She will bloom anew. Thank you. Shifting on to stories and thinking about the stories we have been telling each other. One of the most destructive themes in stories humans have told since the dawn of time centers on our own self-importance, the myth of our self-importance, that the earth was given to us to have dominion over. There have been attempts to correct this narrative, particularly in the last decade or so, in the context of climate change, when we have seen how poorly we have dominated Earth. And the one way to correct that, I believe, is to tell stories that decenter us. Disney is one of those companies that have contributed immensely to climate destruction. However, they're good at telling stories that decenter humanity, and there's something they can teach us about what is specific to humanity, our ability to find compassion with inanimate objects. And these poems try to do similar things. This poem is called Fuck Conferences, which took place when I attended a conference in Washington, D.C. And it just looks at the potential to build narrative, to build connection with things that are not human. Have I told you of the oak that grew where we are now, that you can find in aerial shots of the city going back 60 years before it was slashed down for this conference center, so wide for this conference center which would fit within it, so wide was its trunk. I was thinking how flimsy my limbs would seem held against its slimmest branch. I looked up to check its wondrous penumbra of leaves and saw instead the cast iron beams of the ceiling and not the sky I had seen earlier this morning outside, when I looked and noticed how impossible it is to fully grasp such clear and present borderlessness in which a sparrowhawk swooped, and above it flew an airplane. And though I knew the plane was thousands of feet further up, I stood there just in case the hawk needed me to catch, my fingers laced into a fleshy, ready nest, my breath trapped, my chest clenched, my shuddering, shuddering, shuddering heart. And I was that sky, our bird, this tree, these leaves, the building, you and me. The poem also looks at the potential of complete connectivity. And I think linked to the story of humans' dominance over Earth is the idea that we're somehow distant, we're not part of Mother Nature, we're not just an item in nature's food chain. This poem thinks about nature and looks at trees, perhaps the tree in the previous poem surviving all of humanity. And it is called just that, Fuck Our Future. When our scorching planet ignites the last evacuating airship to cook its soft cargo of human flesh into an expanding fireball and fragments of its propeller blades thunk inches deep into tree trunks in the straggling forest beneath, what I want to know is which will survive, which strain, which wood grain will hold encoded like a fingerprint pushed into wet clay, that final day of reckoning when this cerulean blue ordained world we are corroding a toxin gray begins its self-reclamation, starting with that tree, a lone lieutenant, a desperate sentinel, erect to the falling ball of fire, jet fuel, and smoldering meat, its face of leaves weighed with dust, its waist of branches noosed in plastic bags, yet standing, stubborn in its shaggy majesty, amidst the ship's carnage, like a righteous middle finger thrust at all humanity, proud in the snarling sky. A few more points. I was also asked to talk a little bit about what it means to be human. and what it means to try to keep in connection with our humanity. And I think to be human these days is always to be in conflict, always in opposition, always to strive against time, against mortality, against our primal and final destinations, and to do that whilst using language, right? To use that to create safe spaces in our communities, to use that to communicate our most precious dreams. But the problem with language is that they're very blunt tools at the best of times. I'm a hugger. My best way of communicating with my friends is just to hug them. I think through that comes my utmost sincerity, my deepest apologies. But language is what we have, and I have a strange relationship with language. One of the most powerful is another four-letter word, love. And what I think about in connection to hugs, which are my main source of communication, I think about the sentence, I hug my lover, for instance. If my lover is a sumo wrestler, I mean, I'm hugging someone largely made of meat, a muscle of strength and power and safety. And that's what it means to hug my lover. However, if your lover is a ballerina, then you're hugging someone largely made of backflips and air. They're barely there. Yet, I expect you to understand what it is I mean. And there's huge gulf. There's a whole ocean of meanings that gets lost. However, language is all we have to communicate. And sometimes that creates tensions when a lot is misunderstood. And I think taking care over language is of vital importance, which is why, new mandates from the government to have, to launch, to protect free speech and these sort of pronouncements, they themselves are war on language because of what that means. There's a whole level of double think that's going on in conservative policy. And I just always wonder about what is lost and what is gained. And I want to read this poem I wrote, which is called Fuck Love, which looks at the nuances of what is understood and what is misunderstood. I want to tell my twin sister I love her, but what I really mean is her arm around my waist when we were half-formed halflings in mother's womb is the closest I've ever been to God. I want to tell my mother I love her, but I want to spoon the arthritis out of her swollen knuckles and kiss them back to nimble freedom. I want to tell my father I love him, but will I ever crown him with the comfort he deserves? I want to tell my nephews I love them, but some shadows seethe for black skin, and I want to shield them from its falling. I want to tell my people I love them, but I want them to have thrived on an uncarved continent. I want to tell my lover I love her, but her hug is palatial divinity, is my father's crowning comfort, my mother's prancing hands, my nephew's careless wanderings, is uncharted territory, wild as it is pure. What is it to love when all your meanings are ineffable sufferings? What is it to mean more than you can? Who else carries half hugs in inflamed hands, empty of comforts, full of shadows and ancient, aching acres? I'm speaking a little bit about the various things that humanity is battling with right now. I want to read this poem called Fuck Humanity, which looks at the various things we're fighting against. Fuck humanity, I want to bellow like a card-carried champion of the nihilist society. Fuck all the ways our most earnest, faithful, folded over, humbled, deep down considered attempt at amending our venomous ills undoes itself. Think almond milk and California wildfires. Nitrogen fertilizer and industrial food waste, factory emission limits, and the trade in carbon offsets, the free market and exploitation, voluntary work and white savior complex, vegan avocado diets and deforestation, phones to connect our lonely spirits, and black bodies in coltan mines. Fuck every single attempt. Our best bet is to annihilate our vicious selves. I want to bellow as Ellie pushes her 3-year-old hand into the calloused cave of mine. Her fingers, frail as elderberry petals, flutter. She calls me down to the careful constellations blooming in the brown universe of her brimming eyes, and all I am folds over, humbled, deep down, reconsidering attempt at amending our venomous ills, even if it undoes me. And we have two more poems just to end with. I think in order to tell stories about a future, about our future, in order to see ourselves in the future, we have to keep looking back at the past, because everything that will be has been already. I think of the invention of the internet as emblematic of that. When it was initially created, it was thought to be this completely democratic space, a new frontier for humanity, but instead it's just being used to demonize, to attack people of color. So much of it is being weaponized and restricted. Whole countries can switch off the internet. And we've just found that we're replicating the same mistakes we made in the past. History is the greatest teacher. Looking forward, migration will instantly and increasingly become the stories of our future. We're seeing it right now with conservative policies deporting people to parts of the world which they had critiqued as being unsafe previously. And this is the tip of the iceberg, which is an unfortunate phrase to use because I'm speaking specifically about climate change and the upheaval it will bring to us. But human beings have always migrated. That Africans left the continent a millennia ago is why human beings are present across the world. It is our oldest habit, our most primal bad habits. And trying to legislate against something that is at the basics of humanity somehow means we've forgotten ourselves. So we have to constantly look back in order to understand the future. And these final poems are about migration. I'm an immigrant, so this topic is very close to my heart. The first poem is called "Fuck Border Guards," which is a myth which is a riff on the myth of Icarus. Again, looking at the past in order to imagine the present and the future. Fuck border guards. Heavy booted and uniformed, the armed who man the borders of narrative and myth, who cast the war-torn and hungry as vermin, will say he reached too far, dared dream broader than his country, than wings could carry. That chant of his, that song of light was foreign, sounded like a battle cry, too much like jihad. Icarus's whole flight was ill-advised. The father should have known better. Nothing can be done, nothing as he plunged. And the final poem is called "Fuck Borders." The travelers of woods and waters who left by foot and paddle, who formed horse and saddle, rudder and sail, forged steam and engine and reached the holy grail of flight. So instinctive was collective strive to boldly go and yet go further. They went off-world, zoomed off-planet. The forest spirit child in them who saw no borders in the sky, the winged, wandering wild within is who we have ever been. In time, we'll wake to see the lines, these thin boundaries we have drawn as utter folly, and call out why and when and who and how. Thank you. All the poems I read are from a book called The Actual, and I'm going to put the link in the chat should you want to read it. Thank you very much for listening. Cheers.